Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Kate and today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in the month of February. I am going to start off talking about kind of my general thoughts on the month and my stats for my reading. Then I will move into the books that I did not finish in February, and then I will talk about all of the books that I read, more or less in the order that I read them, except that I will save my favorite book of the month until the very end, because it's just fun for me to talk favorites at the end. If you are not interested in some of these sections, like I know not everybody is interested in reading stats, feel free to skip around. You certainly will not offend me. But I want to make it as useful to you all as I can. So, without any further ado, I will jump on in. In the month of February, I read 12 books, one of which was a novella, and this was a great reading month for me. As far as ratings and as far as number of books read, I'm really happy with my reading in February. I admittedly gives me an inflated sense of my reading because I had finished with school and I was not working, so I had a lot more time for reading and kind of just de-stressing from getting done with the programming bootcamp that I was doing. So it was a mood reading month and just a good month in general. As far as genres go, this was pretty widespread as well. I read 5 fantasy, 1 science fiction, 3 nonfiction, 2 romance, and 1 mystery. And like I said, since it was a mood reading month, I did a fair amount of rereading, which I love to do when it's a series that I really enjoyed. It's fun to jump back in and experience the characters and the setting all over again. So I had 4 rereads in the month of February. And then finally, checking in on the goals that I set for myself in at the beginning of this year. I managed to read not just 1, but 3 nonfiction, so I checked off that goal. Of the 12 that I read, 8 of them were books that I already owned, so I am doing great on that goal, because my goal was to read half of what I read coming from the very full shelves behind me, as well as my very full Kindle. So I am very pleased with my progress on that. I also managed to read one of my book box books, which is fantastic since I have an entire shelf of books I have gotten from subscription boxes that I have not gotten to. So, making progress there. Slightly less great news in that I yet again did not hit my self-pub book goal, and I really need to prioritize this more often because I have really been falling down on this one. I want to support more smaller publishers, more self-published works, so this is really something I want to get better at. So in March, I am definitely going to be focusing on this. And then as far as my reading challenges go, I did complete 3 books that I'm using for Reddit's Our Fantasy Bingo Challenge, and I completed 1 for my Sci-Fi Invaders science fiction centric reading challenge as well. Okay, moving on to my books that I did not finish in the month of February. I had 3 that I started towards the end of the month that I will wait until March to talk about, because I am basically started them at the end of February and continued them into March. I have 2 books didn't continue with, didn't finish, and so I'm now kind of at the state where I decide whether or not I keep putting them on the TBR. The first one is The Humans by Matt Haig. This was a book that I picked up for a book club that I do with Jade's Bedtime Bookworms. I will link her channel below if you want to check that out. We have a great time in that book club, so I highly recommend joining in on that. That is part of her Patreon. And unfortunately, I think I am just going to set this one aside. It's not necessarily a permanent DNF. As far as I'll never pick it back up again. I just would need a lot of convincing. It's a story that follows an alien who basically comes to Earth and impersonates someone who has discovered this knowledge that humankind isn't ready for. And so this alien basically has to erase all trace of it. And it gives me kind of Resident Alien vibes, but less creepy, if you have seen that TV show that's on Sci-Fi. But the writing style just doesn't work very well for me, and I'm not super into alien stories to begin with, so I think I'm just gonna set this one aside. Other one is Engines of Empire by R.S. Ford, which I've talked about before. It's an intriguing world. I'm just not sold on the writing style or the characters. This one I'm less sure of. It's kind of more in the set-aside category where I might have it in a possible books to pick up to mood read, but I'm just not into it, and I don't want to force myself to read something that I'm not into. So we'll just see if I pick it up at some later date. Now, I will go ahead and move into the books that I finished in February. I will start with one of the ones that was actually a carryover from January. Monster, She Wrote by Lisa Kruger and Melanie R. Anderson. I completed this because it counted for the related nonfiction for the R Fantasy Bingo Challenge. It had been highly recommended, and it is basically an exploration of a number of female authors who are writing in the weird fiction genre, so kind of horror, speculative fiction, both a lot of them have fantasy or sci-fi elements in them. The book is basically split into subgenres within weird fictions. It is written basically like having your literature nerd best friend tell you about all of these awesome authors. And what I really liked about this book is that each section kind of talks about the subgenre, talks about the major authors for that section, and for each author, they'll recommend at least one book from them to check out if you haven't read from them before, and also some other similar authors who might work if you really like that one. So it is a fantastic way to get familiar with some lesser known, lesser recognized female authors in weird fiction. So highly recommend. I ended up rating that an 8.9 out of 10 or 4.5 stars. Then I will talk about a book that I finished as part of a read-along, which was the Green Rider read-along that Fine over at Fine Reads is doing. And this is a classic 90s epic fantasy series. It follows a young woman named Kerrigan who ends up getting involved in a lot of political intrigue when she ends up running into basically a dying messenger and offers to carry this message to the king, and ends up getting involved with a group known as the Green Riders, who are all messengers for the king but also do some other things, and there's magic related to this group. So it is written a little bit younger. It's definitely horse focused, so if any of those things appeal to you, it's definitely worth checking out. For me, I had picked this up because this has a lot of comparisons to Mercedes Lackey's Heralds of Valdemar series, which I adored when I was younger. The writing style in this first one was a little bit rough for me. I believe it was Britain's debut, and it's just, there are some info dumps that kind of took me out of the story, and it's fairly slow going in the first half. Basically, as soon as you hit that 50% mark, everything speeds up. I was really interested in the magic system that gets introduced, so I'm not sure it's the best intro necessarily because it does take a little bit to get going, but I'm definitely curious to see where the series goes. It does remind me of Heralds of Valdemar, so I don't think that's a bad comparison, but I'm hoping that the writing style will work better for me in the next one. The next one that I'll mention is the novella that I read. This is also the science fiction book that I read in February, and amusingly enough, I talked about it in my January wrap-up because I was talking about all of the Murderbot books that I was reading that month, and accidentally wrapped this one in there, and this is Fugitive Telemetry by Martha Wells. It is the most current book in her Murderbot series about a snarky AI who ends up getting involved in helping out a bunch of humans in various situations. And this one is Murderbot basically as a detective where he has to solve a murder mystery on a space station. I loved it. I did talk about this in January, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about it, but if you enjoy Murderbot as a character, it's a fun, romp with a murder mystery with them, and I just really, really enjoyed it. That was a 9.3 out of 10 or 5 stars. The next book I read was Index, A History of the by Dennis Duncan. This is a nonfiction book that is all about the history of the index, basically from the medieval time period all the way up to the present with search engines. It's interesting, but it's definitely more of an academic history, as you might expect. I would not recommend it unless you are very interested in literature indexes or how it's kind of been used throughout history. Like I said, the author expects you to have a certain knowledge of literature and history that I don't think everybody is going to be real comfortable with. And it's got a more dry, it does have a sense of humor to it, but even that is pretty dry. So worth picking up if you're interested in those subjects, but one I would skip if you're not. I got this as an e-arc from NetGalley. It was published on February 15th. I ended up giving this 6.7 out of 10 or 3 stars. The final nonfiction of the month was Rogues Gallery by John Aller. I ended up picking this up while I was in New York City on a trip with my mom. And per my usual, every time I go to museums and galleries and stuff like that, I love checking for books that are related because I think that's a fun souvenir because that's kind of person I am, I guess. And I not only picked this one up on this trip, I finished it on this trip because I had a really hard time putting it down. It's a history of crime and policing in York during the Gilded Age. The author is a former journalist and former lawyer, and he does a fantastic job of really exploring these relationships between the various criminal elements, the personalities that are involved, as well as how the police interacted with them, and then some of the kind of political maneuvering and corruption within the system that kind of allowed certain types of crime to flourish, and how that faded from these gentlemen bank robbers into the mafia and kind of the rise of these mafia families towards the end of this time period. Aller makes this so compelling. I happen to love history and am interested in true crime, so I think both of those things helped, but I think Aller also has a really excellent way of making this history come to life and debunking rumors and hearsay without actually getting too dry or academic. So I would highly recommend it to anybody who is interested in history and true crime, and I don't think you need to have much background knowledge to enjoy this book. I ended up giving it an 8.9 out of 10 or 4.5 stars, and it is my favorite nonfiction of the month. Then I picked up my first romance of the month, and that was Hunt the Stars by Jessie Mihalik. This was an e-arc that I got from NetGalley. It came out on my birthday, February 1st, and it was a fun little treat. It is a sci-fi romance, which is a little unusual for me. I typically, if I'm going to read romance, really only read historical romance. Regency era, usually. Like Julia Quinn, if you've watched Bridgerton or any of those, kind of that time period tends to be my favorite as far as romance goes. But this was really fun. It is a fairly slow, character-driven story with the romance kind of taking a back seat to the exploration of like relationships between the characters. So the romance doesn't get steamy until pretty close to the end of the book. So if you like a lot of steamy scenes in your romance, this may not completely satisfy you. It gave me Firefly vibes. I haven't read Becky Chambers, but I think that kind of slower character-driven exploration, it seems to be character-driven type stories, seems to be more where this sits. So I ended up giving this a 7.6 out of 10 or 4 stars. I'd recommend it if you are a fan of slower character-driven romances, but not so much if you're super into the steamy or fast-paced ones. Then, after I watched the new Kenneth Branagh Poirot movie, I ended up picking up Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie. I had read this previously, and I really wanted to reread it and kind of see how it influenced my thoughts on the movie, which unfortunately were not super positive. I didn't particularly enjoy Branagh's first Poirot, so I was kind of hoping this would change my mind, and it did not. However, talking about the book, this is one of my favorite Agatha Christie books and one of my favorite Poirot stories. So it follows a kind of unassuming Belgian detective, Hercule Poirot, as he ends up on a river cruise on the Nile in Egypt. And as happens to Poirot, and probably only Poirot while he's on his vacation, a wealthy heiress is murdered on the boat, and he has to figure out who is responsible, which is complicated by the fact that everybody on the boat has a reason to want her dead. But what I really love about Death on the Nile is it does a fantastic job of humanizing Poirot, because sometimes he is very intelligent but also fairly arrogant, and his interactions with the characters here really dig into that the darker side of humanity, and I would highly recommend this story. You do not need to read any other Poirot. I'm sure it helps, but this one was actually the second Poirot book I ever read, and that is not in order. So I would recommend picking this up if you like detective murder mystery stories, but just be aware that it is definitely dated. So there's definitely some elements of racism and stereotypes in here that are less great to read about. I ended up giving this a 9.4 out of 10, or 5 stars. I just love Poirot, and like I said, I really think this is one of the best as far as kind of being this very interesting exploration of a murder mystery. There's things I want to say but can't say for spoiler reasons. So like I said, I feel like it's very much worth checking out. The next one I'm going to talk about is a book that was very nearly a favorite of the month, but it just got edged out by the favorite that I will end up talking about this month. So this is The Justice of Kings by Richard Swan. I really enjoyed this one. I got an e-arc from NetGalley. It was published on February 22nd, and I am actually going to be doing a dedicated review for this, because there are a lot of things that I want to talk about with Justice of Kings. So the most I'll say here is that it is a historical fantasy book that follows a magistrate who is tasked with bringing the emperor's justice to all the corners of this empire. It has very strong vibes of Eastern Europe, kind of Holy Roman Empire style empire building and kind of time period. I would probably describe it as a mix of The Witcher and like Law and Order. So I would recommend people not think of this as a sort of Judge Dredd type character, because it's a lot more nuanced than that. But like I said, I'll get into it in the dedicated review. I think this will work best for fans of historical fantasy. I ended up giving it an 8.6 out of 10, or 4.5 stars. And I used this as my R Fantasy pick for a mystery plot. Next two books I will talk about together, and that is The Girl in the Tower and The Winter of the Witch by Catherine Arden. In February, we finished out our read-along of the Winternight series that we were doing with Evie over at She Was Only Evie, which was a great read-along. I was so happy to be able to participate in this, because Winternight is one of my favorite fantasy series ever. Speaking of historical fantasy, this is a historical fantasy set in Russia that combines Russian mythology with early medieval Russian history, and it does it in a very compelling way with a young character who is kind of trying to find her place in the world when she doesn't really fit into what society expects from her. And I have not read any other author besides Neil Gaiman who can handle kind of that darker fairy tale vibe. And also, and Arden really also brings in a lot of historical detail and immersive world building that just worked perfectly for me. So I would highly recommend this if you are at all into fantasy with historical elements or fairy tale elements. So definitely one I'd recommend. I gave The Girl in the Tower 8.9 out of 10 or 5 stars, and I gave Winter of the Witch, which I think ties all of the threads together perfectly, a 9.7 out of 10, also 5 stars. I will go ahead and link in the cards and in the description as well the live show that we did for Winter of the Witch. I would recommend reading the series first if you haven't, just because there will be spoilers. I think we kept the first part spoiler free, but it's the third book in the series, so it's really only spoiler free for that third book. There are still likely at least minimal spoilers for the first two. Then I will talk about the last read-along book that I had in the month of February, and that is A Natural History of Dragons by Marie Brennan. You will see a theme here because this one is another less historical fantasy. It is definitely influenced by Victorian England, but she's changed a lot of the names. The map's totally different, but you can definitely see these influences pretty heavily. It follows, it's basically the memoirs of an esteemed dragon naturalist who has made a career of studying dragons and kind of the science behind them. And it's her telling the story of how she got started. And it's the first book in this Lady Trent series. So I would highly recommend it if you are interested. If you're a dragon fiend like I am, if you like kind of historically based fantasy, and if you want a story where the dragons are really more of like beasts in nature than they are animal companions. I will say that this first one is pretty slow to start because it has more of an Austen or Bridgerton feel to it, where you have a lot of high society stuff going on as the young character, as the main character kind of navigates the marriage market before she ends up going on her expedition. So definitely a slower start. I have heard that it gets a little more fast paced as the story goes and she gets into more adventures, but just know that going in. I gave this an 8 out of 10 or 4 stars. So you might notice a slight difference in lighting for this last section where I talk about my favorite. That is because I had to take a small break, but I wanted to take some time to really talk about my favorite, and that is A Marvelous Light by Freya Marsk. This was a bit of a surprise to me because I do really enjoy historical romance, but I don't read a lot of fantasy romance. This is one of very few that I've ever read, and I really loved it. It was just very heartwarming and exactly what I needed in February. The story is set in a sort of alternate Edwardian England. So basically, if you're familiar with the Victorian age, just post-Victorian. And I think it's also considered gaslamp fantasy, if I remember correctly. But basically, you have this hidden magical side to the world that normal people don't know anything about. And one of the main characters, Robin Blythe, is a young nobleman who ends up getting assigned as a liaison to this hidden magical side of the world. He's basically just supposed to keep track of magical things happening in the world and make sure that normal people don't find out about them. And then communicate with both the Prime Minister and the magical liaison, who is another nobleman, Edwin Corsi. And Edwin has kind of gotten used to working with Robin's predecessor, who has mysteriously disappeared, and he's not totally ready to work with someone new. As in, he's not the greatest at interacting with others. He's very prickly. This has a very strong Grump Sunshine dynamic to it. But when Robin ends up getting cursed in the course of his duties, he ends up working with Edwin to figure out not only what happened to his predecessor, but how to get rid of this curse. And so they end up getting kind of entangled in this mystery and have to work together to solve it. And what I loved best about this, and it was kind of a thing I struggled with in a similar book, Witchmark by C.L. Polk, is that I really bought into the romance. I liked that Edwin was coming from this more magical family, but he's the least magical of them and constantly is basically bullied for his lack of talent and has kind of sunk himself into his books and his studies as a way of dealing with the world. And then you have Robin, who's very sporty, but is trying to make the best of things for his family and provide for his younger sister. And so I really liked seeing how they figured out not only how to work together, but then how that romance started to blossom. I also really liked that the conflicts that came up between Robin and Edwin felt natural and not engineered by the author because they felt like, okay, well, we're at this point, we need to have a conflict now, which can sometimes happen with romances, or it feels that way for me with some romances. So I really, really loved getting to see that romance develop. And then I will put in the caveat that this is a very steamy romance. I have not read, I'm used to my historical Regency romances, which have some detail, but not quite at the level that A Marvelous Light does. So that was an interesting surprise, and definitely something I feel like if you don't like steamy romances as much, you probably won't enjoy A Marvelous Light as much as I did. But for me, that kind of mix of hidden magic plus these historical elements and then this romance that I could invest in really won me over and put this book above anything else I read in February, even though I've read some really great books this month. So if you are interested in fantasy romance, I would highly recommend checking this one out. I ended up giving A Marvelous Light an 8.6 out of 10 or 4.5 stars. So that is everything that I read in the month of February. If you have read any of these, let me know what your thoughts were on them, even if you didn't enjoy them as much as I did, or if you loved them and I didn't. And let me know what your favorite book of February was. I will see you guys in the next one, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.